Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark, and we are in Mark chapter 14. We're going to be starting at verse 26 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, verses 26 to 31 deal with Jesus foretelling Peter's denial. All right, so Jesus is going to tell Peter that he's going to be denying him. Remember, the context is Jesus is up in the upper room with his disciples, partaking of the Passover lamb. And now let's get into verse 26, and they are still there in the upper room. And it says here, and when they had sung an hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. Now, it says here, when they had sung an hymn, and it was tradition in those days when eating the Passover to sing one or more songs of what is called the Hallel Psalms. It's called the Hallel Psalms. And the Hallel Psalms are from Psalm 113 to Psalm 118. They are considered the Hallel songs and Psalms, and it was traditional, it may even still be today, to sing one or several of the Hallel songs during Passover, the eating of Passover. Now, and it says here, they went out into the Mount of Olives. Now, they leave the upper room where they had just eaten the Passover. Now, no provision had been made for them to spend the night in Jerusalem. There would be no sleeping for any one of them tonight. Remember, the Passover began when? In our day, we would think of it that the Passover begins on Thursday evening at sundown. They eat the Passover. And remember, the next day, Friday, is when Jesus is crucified. And from that time, the time they eat the Passover, until the time Jesus is crucified, the disciples have no idea that they're not going to be sleeping tonight. Jesus knows it. Jesus knows what's coming. But the disciples, they're leaving the Passover and they're going out to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples are probably thinking, yeah, we'll probably head back to Bethany like we always have. And then have some sleep and come back in the morning. But it's not going to happen tonight. Every single day of this past week, Jesus and his disciples had passed over the Mount of Olives on their way back to Bethany. But tonight, Jesus will lead them only as far as the Mount of Olives. Now, it says here in verse 27, and Jesus said unto them, all ye shall be offended because of me this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered. Jesus said, all ye. It wasn't just Peter who would deny Jesus, but the other 10 also. The other 10 would also leave Jesus behind also. And it says here, you will be offended because of me this night. This Greek word for offended is scandalizo, and it means a stumbling block. It means anything that becomes a hindrance or causes someone to fall. Jesus' arrest was a stumbling block for the 11. Like any of us, the disciples entered into what's called self-preservation mode. When Jesus was betrayed, they were thinking about themselves and they left also. The disciples had been with Jesus for 3 years, and they saw everything that he did and heard, all his teachings. They also had private talks with Jesus on their journeys, right? I mean, Jesus traveling all around Galilee. It's like I said recently, you know, we hold the Bible in our hand, and you can pick up you can read the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. You can read any one of those Gospels, and you could probably, if you sit down on a Saturday or a Sunday, whatever, and you can read those Gospels straight through, each one probably in 2-3 hours, right? Maybe less. So Jesus's 3 or 3.5 years of history is condensed into about a 3-hour reading, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of things that Jesus, all of his travels around Galilee, and going from Galilee down to Jerusalem, back up to Galilee, and then going up to Tyre and Sidon, and going up to heal the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, and raising her dead, and the times of going around the sea. There was a lot of times that the disciples spent with Jesus, and they heard him speak. And yet after all of this, they still run from Jesus in his hour of need. Human nature cannot be trusted. Words of sincerity are not enough to guarantee that someone will be steadfast. Just because someone says, I'll be with you, I'll stick with you. Hey, the flesh is weak. The flesh is weak. Even great men and women of God can fall away from the faith under trials. If we learn anything from our daily experiences, it's not to be too fast to show how humble we are to others. Remember that we are but dust with a sinful nature, and we know and serve God only because of his grace and mercy. Don't trust the flesh. The Bible says Jesus knew what was in man. He didn't trust him, right? And so also we're getting ready to hear about Peter's great, confession. I'll stick with you. I won't deny you, Lord, right? Yeah, he's just but dust with a sin nature in it. Reject self-dependence for God's dependence, right? Reject your own self-dependence. I'll be faithful to God. No, you won't. No, you'll only be faithful to God as you submit to God, and God makes you faithful to him. I don't mean forces you, but I mean it's only his provisions that help keep us to be faithful to the Lord. And then he says here in verse 27, he says, "For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep shall be scattered," right? He says, for it is written, right? Jesus quotes Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. The disciples' denial of Jesus was the fulfillment of this verse. Now we go to verse 28, and it says, "But after that I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee." He says, but, which means be of good cheer. So Jesus is saying, you're going to deny me, and you're going to be scattered, and you're going to be offended of me, but don't worry. I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise from the dead, and I'll go before you into Galilee. So you're going to see something, terrible happen. You're going to see me crucified on a cross and die. But don't be worried. And this word "but" means be of good cheer. It's not over. That's what Easter is about. It's not over. Jesus said in verse 27, what Jesus said in verse 27 was reason for them to be very sorrowful. But now he gives them assurance that they will see him again. And not only see them again, but it will be up in Galilee. Galilee is the place where they are all from. And it is away from Jerusalem. Galilee is far away from Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not a friendly place for anyone who was a follower of Jesus, especially for the disciples. And we see that John chapter 20, verse 19. Let's read that. John 20 and verse 19. And it says, "Then the same day at the evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear." What? This was after Jesus was crucified, right? The disciples are in Jerusalem, and what's happening? The same day, in the evening, at night, being the first day of the week, where were they? They were in a place where the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled. Why? For fear of the Jews. Came Jesus, and he stood in the midst and said unto them, "Peace be unto you." Right? So here's the disciples. Jerusalem was not a friendly place for anyone who believed in Jesus, especially the disciples. They were huddled in a room with the door shut and the curtains pulled down, right? They were hiding. Even after Jesus' resurrection, an angel told Mary Magdalene and another Mary to tell Jesus' disciples that Jesus will go before them into Galilee and to meet them there. And it says that in Matthew 28, verse 7. So Jesus said, "I will see you." Jesus said in verse 28, "But after I am risen, I will go before you into Galilee." So Jesus tells his disciples, "I'll go before you into Galilee." And now Jesus tells Mary and the other Mary to go tell the disciples to go to Galilee, and I'll see you there. Now verse 29, "But Peter said unto him, Although all shall be offended, yet will not I." Right? "I will not be offended of you, Lord." Well, Peter did what probably we all would do, right? And it implied that Jesus was wrong and that we would be faithful to the end. Christians think that they are strong in the faith. They are strong in purity, in patience, that they are stronger in these things than what they really are. But when tests and temptations come, then they stumble and they fall. The solution to keep oneself from falling is not to be conscious of our seeming strengths, but of our weaknesses and of our dependence upon God. Listen. God's ways are not I said a couple lessons. God's ways are not our ways. God's thoughts are not our ways, our thoughts. If you want to be faithful to God, the only way we're going to be faithful to God and to the Lord is to remember we are weak. Not to think of yourself as strong, but to think of yourself as weak and in need of his strength. Because when we think we're strong in the faith, we're strong in prayer, we're strong, and when we think that's when we're more vulnerable to fall. But when we think ourselves as being weak and helpless, then we're always dependent upon the Lord. So here Peter comes and he's like, I'll follow you. I'll stay with you. I won't deny you, Lord. Oh, well, he was depending upon his own strength. And he needed to have his weaknesses revealed. He needed to see himself as he was, and he didn't yet. What Peter should have said was, Lord, what you said will probably happen. So I need to trust in your forgiveness and grace to help me through it. Instead of saying, verse 29, though all be offended, yet will not I. No, he's going to be offended. Peter should have just said, you know what, we know what's going to happen to you, but I need God's strength to help me through this time, to watch you go to the cross and die on the cross. Verse 30, and Jesus said unto him, verily I say unto you, that this day, even in this night, before the cock crow twice, you shall deny me 3 times. All right? And we're gonna finish this in this verse here, this lesson in this verse. In this verse, Jesus gives 3 steps to the exact time that Peter is going to deny him. Not only are you going to deny me, Peter, but I'll tell you almost exactly the right time you're going to deny me, right? He says, first, this day, right? This day, which had already begun at sundown, right? Then number 2, even in this night, right? It would which means that it would happen before the sun comes up. Remember, there's 2 parts of a day. There's the nighttime and there's the daytime. So Jesus is saying in this day, all right, well, this day, is it nighttime or daytime? Now Jesus says, even in this night, right? Which means now Jesus is whittling it down to the nighttime. And then he says what? Before the cock crows 3 times. Oh, which seems that it would be closer to when the sun would rise. So Jesus is saying, not only do I know you're going to deny me, but I know exactly what time you're going to deny me. It's going to be this day. It's going to be during the nighttime of this day. And it's going to be what time of the nighttime? Early nighttime, middle nighttime, or late nighttime? Oh, it's going to be late nighttime. It's going to be just before the sun comes up. Just when the cock crows, right? 3 times, you're going to deny me. Yeah. Oh, that's when. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, verses 31 and 32, Jesus tells Peter that Satan desires to put Peter through the ringer. And Jesus' response in verse 32 is that Jesus has prayed for Peter not to be kept from the ringer. Listen, not to be kept from Satan's pressures and trial, but that Peter's faith would not fail when he's going through it. Right? So Jesus said, I know that you want to stay steadfast, but you're not. You're going to deny me. And I also know that Satan has desired to sift you like wheat. But I've prayed for you. Jesus said, I've prayed for you. Jesus didn't say, I prayed for you that you wouldn't be sifted by Satan. No. He said, I prayed for you that while you go through Satan's sifting, that you will stay true to me, right? That your faith will not fail. So Jesus doesn't, our walk with God is not one of all pleasures and flowers and stuff. No, we go through trials. And when Jesus prays for us in our daily life, He prays that we will have the strength to go through. He doesn't pray that we are released from these trials or delivered from but that when we go through them, we have the faith and the strength to go stay faithful to him and his word through the trial. How would Peter face himself after denying the Lord if the Lord hadn't prayed for him? Right? How would Peter have faced himself after Peter had denied the Lord? We're going to get to that in a little bit, where he denies the Lord. And he goes out and he weeps bitterly, tremendously. But how would he, Peter's, the condemnation, the guilt, the shame, how would he have felt if Jesus hadn't prayed for him to come through that? Verse 31, we'll finish in verse 31. And it says here, but he spoke the more vehemently, if I should die with you, I will not deny thee in any wise. And likewise also said they all. So it says here in verse 31, but he spake, and that's in the imperfect tense, meaning that Peter didn't just say it one time, he said it over and over again. Peter kept saying, Peter, I will not deny. No, I'm not going to deny you. I don't care I'm not going to deny you. And he kept saying it over and over to the Lord. I'm not going to deny you, Lord. And he says here, Peter, but he spoke the more vehemently. And this Greek word for vehemently is ekperisos, and it means exceedingly or abundantly. So Peter kept on saying over and over with passion and with feeling. So it's not like he just says it, but he says it strongly with feeling. I will not deny you, Lord. And then it says, likewise also said they all. Don't think that Peter was alone in what he said and what he meant. Peter was just the one that voiced his thoughts. But the other 10 felt the same way too. It was only Peter who said it, but the others felt the same way. So here, Peter now is going to have his heart revealed to him. Look, don't blame Peter. We would have probably said and felt the same thing. They all did. Peter wasn't the only one that felt that way about, I'll never deny you. I'll stay true to you even to death, right? Well, they all thought it. And you know what? If we were there, we would have said the same thing. We would have felt the same way. But what we would be doing is what they would be. We would be giving our human strength to the Lord. We would be offering to the Lord our human strength. And it's going to be revealed that human strength isn't anywhere near enough if we're going to stay faithful to the Lord. What we need, if you want to stay faithful to the Lord, you need human weakness. You need to see your human weakness and to trust God. Your human weakness will drive you to the Lord, to drive you to pray and seek God for his strength to keep you faithful, not for your strength, but for his strength. All right, we're going to start verse 32 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.